Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Dear Roundtable. We're thrilled to have Anthony Apollo, Executive Director of the Wyoming Stable Token Commission, with us today. Anthony leads one of the most groundbreaking initiatives in the digital money space, the Wyoming Stablecoin, the first fiat-backed, fully reserved stable token issued by a public entity in the United States. Stablecoins have emerged as a key component in the evolution of digital money, bridging the gap between traditional financial systems and blockchain technology. They offer the promise of secure, efficient, and transparent transactions with the potential to transform everything from cross-border payments to public sector operations, potentially. Wyoming has positioned itself at the forefront of this movement, creating a blueprint for what stable or state-backed innovation can look like. Today, Anthony will walk us through the Wyoming Stablecoin's background, vision, progress, and its implications. And we are fortunate to have him here with us today. Following his presentation, we'll open the floor to questions from YouTube chat, so feel free to share your thoughts and queries as we go along. Before we get going, we'd like to perhaps just extend a special thank you to the Dear Standard membership. To keep the narratives around digital currencies and education moving forward. But without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Anthony, and we can get kicked off with discussing the importance and the background and all the juicy stuff related to the Wyoming Stablecoin project. Anthony, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Conrad. Thank you, Tamara. I'd like to thank the Digital Euro Association for giving me this time to present to you today. I will go ahead and share my screen and we will take it from there. So hopefully this shows up. And I'm not entirely sure how to make it full screen, but we'll go click this. And hopefully, Conrad, that looks okay on your side.
That looks perfect. Thanks, Anthony.
Excellent. So before we kick off, there are some disclaimers here. I'll just leave this on the screen for a moment, but it's important to note that everything I say today will be my own personal opinion and that we do not offer any investment advice. And further, we have not selected a singular blockchain to launch on yet, and no Wyoming stable tokens have been minted, issued, or released yet. So as a quick introduction to myself, my name is Anthony Apollo. I am the Executive Director of the Wyoming Stable Token Commission. I am the first director of the commission, and I started my tenure in this role back in September of 2023. So we're approaching that 1.5 year mark soon. The first half of my career was spent in traditional finance. I spent time at KPMG and Ernst & Young in both accounting and advisory practices, with a focus on regulatory reporting, specifically in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, working at some of the large banks and working with them to do enhanced reporting, and when that detail was needed following the Dodd-Frank Act. I pivoted to blockchain professionally in 2017. I joined a Ethereum incubator firm called Consensus based in Brooklyn, New York. When I was there, I worked on tokenized intellectual property as well as tokenized fan engagement programs. I then worked on a tokenized debt security on Ethereum with a professional basketball player named Spencer Dinwiddie, then on the Brooklyn Nets, now on the Dallas Mavericks after a stint on the Lakers. He did essentially a bond, a tokenized bond with monthly payouts to investors in stablecoin. So that ran from 2020 to 2023 and reached full maturity. I then spun up a company called Rensa with my brothers, which was focused on tokenized digital multimedia, real-time payouts to content creators, and codified royalties via smart contracts. And during the build of that project, myself and my brothers moved to the state of Wyoming here in the US because they have the most permissive legislative environment around cryptocurrency, blockchain, and digital assets. To put kind of the stable token to the forefront here, the Wyoming Stable Token Commission does intend to launch the first fiat-backed, fully reserved stable token issued by a public entity in the United States in the first half of this year. we call it the WIS, the Wyoming Stable Token, will be a digital asset on a public blockchain, redeemable for $1. And to be very specific from the get-go here, we are not building a central bank digital currency. We are not creating Wyoming coin. We are not printing some kind of currency out of the ether, pun not intended. This is intended to look a bit like USDC from Circle or PYUSD from PayPal, with some differentiators that we'll get into in the near future. So why is the state of Wyoming working on this initiative specifically? Well, Wyoming has already passed over 40 different laws in the state around, again, crypto, blockchain, digital assets. And the stable token is meant to function as glue between some of these different and disparate initiatives. When you have these digitally native programs and value is going to transfer between them, we wanted to make sure that there was a digitally native, stable transfer of value between those things, and hence the stable token. Further, as a kind of a side benefit, we do intend to back the Wyoming stable token with cash, US Treasuries, and US Treasury repurchase agreements. So those latter two are going to be interest-bearing securities. So when the state receives the interest for holding those US debt securities, that interest is going to go into our school foundation fund. So on a quarterly basis, and this is per statute, we'll get into that a bit more later. Per statute, we have a responsibility to sweep those funds, sweep that interest income into the school foundation fund and pay for schools in that capacity in the state. To give a little bit more color on what Wyoming has done and what I'll refer to from here on out as generally the Web3 space, we do have a history of progressive legislation in the state. Wyoming was the state that created the LLC before that became kind of Delaware's gig. But the state has looked at emerging technologies all along the way to see how they can create a permissive environment to cultivate businesses in those different sectors. So when it comes to Web3 specifically, and this is just a high-level view of some of the legislation that's passed. Again, there's been 45 bills passed since 2016. A high-level view of this would cut up some of these categories into, let's say, property rights. For example, the Secretary of State's office has a digital asset registry where you can register your asset that's on a blockchain. There's considerations around privacy. So one of the key ones that we have on the books here is the prohibition of private key disclosure, which states in any kind of civil or criminal proceedings, you cannot be compelled to give up your private keys. That would be a breach of the First Amendment. We can't compel speech as a state. And then there's different entity structures as well. So you may have heard of the DAO LLCs. There's also, as of last year, the DUNAs, decentralized, unincorporated, nonprofit associations, which is a bit of a mouthful, but that's essentially the next evolution of a DAO LLC. It gives legal recognition to DAOs with over 100 members, and it lets them do things like sign business contracts and everything a normal business would need to do. And then there's also the special purpose depository institutions, which are a specific type of banking-like charter where they would be fully reserved financial institutions. So for every dollar that's on deposit, there would be $1 or more backing it. And they'd also be allowed to custody digital assets. And then I've added a bucket here for revenue diversification. The Wyoming stable token would certainly fit into that, but there are many others that would get into that realm, especially because in Wyoming, a lot of the state's revenues are generated from business registrations, for example, these LLCs. In terms of how the stable token came to fruition, well, that was the Stable Token Act that passed in early 2023. It did two fairly simple things. It created the Stable Token Commission and gave it the remit to create the Wyoming stable token. There's more context than that, but at a fairly high level, that's what it looked to accomplish. I'd also like to specify that in the state, this is a program with an extremely high level of transparency and oversight. We have 7 commissioners. The chairman of the commission is the governor, Mark Gordon, of the state of Wyoming. On the commission, we also have the state treasurer, Kurt Meyer, and the state auditor, Christy Racines. There's also 4 additional subject matter advisors who came on the commission. One of those is Flavia Naves, who was formerly the general counsel at Circle, to give you an idea of the caliber of people we're working with here. And then, of course, I was appointed as the executive director again in September of 2023. Last year, we passed some amendments to the Stable Token Act, and by We, I mean the state legislature. What they did was create a method for our commission to create its own procurement process, which is based on other procurement processes in the state. It's not like we have unilateral authority, but we did recognize that to put together a stable token would look very different than how procurement's typically done. So the legislature gave us a bit of carve out for that, and then we had to pass rules to define how that process will work. And we also clarified what asset types would be permitted investments for the dollars we get for the stable token, right? So someone wants a Wyoming stable token, US dollars come our way. Those dollars will be, some of them will be left in cash because we need those dollars to meet redemptions when people want to transfer from stable tokens back to dollars. So there'll always be some amount held in cash, but the remainder would be kept in US Treasury securities with 365 days or less to maturity, for US Treasury security repurchase or reverse repurchase agreements with 30 days or less to maturity. So again, we wanted to make these very tight on kind of the timeline. We saw what happened with SVB and Silvergate, particularly around Circle, when they were kind of further out on the Treasury curve, and there was obviously some volatility with yields, and that caused some issues there. But we've learned those lessons by monitoring those kind of use cases and have created statutory rails and guardrails essentially to make sure that we don't end up in those same types of issues. And then where are we now? So we are rapidly advancing towards the development, deployment, and ongoing management of the Wyoming stable token. Since I came on board in September, we've received an extensive amount of inbound interest, about over 700 people, over 350 organizations. And that includes everyone from vendors who want to help us build a Wyoming stable token, as well as people in the policy sector, domestically, internationally, and beyond. One of the very interesting exercises we did that I'll probably spend a few minutes on here is blockchain selection. We, again, as I said earlier on the disclaimers, we haven't picked a singular blockchain, but we wanted to pick a cohort of blockchains that would allow us to kind of focus in what our offering would look like. And of course, base that on some observable and objective data that we were able to pull together with a working group, but I'll come back to that in a moment. We had a request for qualifications period that kicked off in November and ended before the holidays in December. Essentially, we are looking for multiple different functions, and we need to know which vendors are qualified to build those out. And then that leads to our request for proposal period, which is currently ongoing. Some are due on January 30th, others are due on February 7th. But that is a subset of this procurement process, which qualified vendors have been invited to. Now, I kind of sped through that, but I wanted to provide a little more context along the way here because I think it's a testament to the amount of effort the state of Wyoming has put into this process. So when we talk about blockchain selection, this was not something where the commission just picked 10 chains at random. What we did was spun up a working group, the blockchain selection working group, within our technology subcommittee. And that was comprised of multiple commissioners, multiple agency resources, and then we brought in a number of subject matter advisors as well to help us kind of bring this forward. The first thing we did was set criteria, which would score different chains based on their capabilities and, again, objective data that was available, as well as, and importantly, 5 binary criteria. Essentially, you needed to have the blockchain, the network, had to have all 5 of these binary criteria to be considered for scoring. And those included things like being a public and permissionless network, because we do intend to build on public infrastructure, having a permissioned onboarding capability, because we as a state of Wyoming may need to do KYC or AML checks before we let someone use a Wyoming stable token. We may need that vector for onboarding. Another one was the chain needed to be already in scope with several of the on-chain analytics firms, ones that worked with US federal or other regulators. So we want to make sure that the chain that we're on has that kind of support. And then importantly, one of those capabilities is called freeze and seize. We need to make sure that Wyoming stable tokens do not end up with malicious actors. For example, the Lazarus Group in North Korea, Hamas. We needed to make sure that if stable tokens ended up where we don't want them, we have the ability to perform some kind of interdiction. That being said, because that sounds kind of scary, we as a state will have a lot of rails in place and guardrails in place to make sure that there's no way anyone on our side can do any kind of unilateral interdiction. There will need to be subpoena processes, multi-sig solutions before anything actually gets interdicted. So as that process continued, we identified about 30 different chains that would be in scope for assessment. Those binary criterias cut that down by about half. So we did a scoring assessment for those 14 chains. And of those 14, the working group recommended as layer ones, Solana, Sui, Ethereum, Stellar, and Avalanche based on their scores to the commission, as well as Polygon, Base, Arbitrum, and Optimism as layer 2 solutions. This was presented to the commission. The commission voted to approve both the criteria and the selection, and we moved on from there with the RFQs. I do want to specify that all of this information is publicly available on our website. Everything we do, we are very much building in public. Our website is actually based on Notion, so you can see a lot of the content there. I've asked the team at the DEA after this presentation, I could send this PDF to them, and then they could distribute that to the group if that's appropriate. But I do want to point out that, again, both the memo summarizing all of this, the scoring criteria, and how the scoring was accomplished, it's all publicly available. In terms of the request for qualifications, this is again where we're, to a certain extent, trying to put a, as we say, putting a square peg through a round hole. We are trying to create essentially a startup within the context of US state government, which is a little bit tough. But one of the things we're doing is request for qualifications that would allow us to engage with a number of vendors who can provide all of the different constituent components of stable token development. We're not looking to build everything from scratch. In our blockchain selection exercise, for example, the term we use frequently was existing and demonstrable capabilities. We want to work with teams that have already built the different components of a stable token before, whether that's the smart contract that would actually issue and govern the token, whether that's the exchange it would be listed on, or whether that's the financial counterparty who could help us with taking in those dollars and investing them appropriately. We need to engage all these parties separately. So we now have 7 different RFPs that are live and 19 functions therein. Again, the RFPs are not live on our site because those were distributed directly to qualified vendors. But again, all of the RFQ content and what those functions are is readily available. So that's where we are now in terms of the build out. And we'll talk about next steps later, but we are going to move quickly through the rest of this process. Just a quick temperature check here, and to make sure we're all on the same page around stablecoins. Stablecoins have really emerged as the killer app for blockchain. This is a industry that has increased from about $135 billion at the beginning of 2024. We're now at about $215 billion of stablecoins. And in terms of the transaction volume of stablecoins, this is something that now compares to networks like Visa. So this is continuing to take off as a use case within the digital asset sector. To dovetail off of that, I wanted to quickly talk about some of the possible use cases for a Wyoming stable token. And to be specific, because I haven't said this yet, this is not something the state of Wyoming is looking to issue and have it only be live within the confines of the state of Wyoming. We do intend this to be certainly a domestic product, and then international, and also on DeFi platforms. They might take some time for us to get there. There might be some beta testing involved and making sure we have the appropriate compliance framework in place. But we do intend, again, to be used pretty much anywhere that incumbent stable tokens are utilized. And some of those use cases may include, for example, the institutional use case, where financial institutions can send these back and forth. If you're following along with what JP Morgan is working on for us overseas in the APAC region, this is where they have their JPM coin on the blockchain formerly known as Onyx, now known as Kinexus. They're processing over $1 billion in daily transactions. The hope is if we have a state-issued stable token, we could facilitate roles like these, hopefully on a public network. From a retail perspective, when we get to that kind of end user, a Wyoming stable token could be used to facilitate peer-to-peer payments similar to other fintech platforms, and hopefully eliminate transaction fees associated with credit cards. Again, if you recall some of those networks we're working on, a number of them are highly efficient and highly scalable with very low transaction fees. Coinbase did some research back in 2022 that showed if American buyers and sellers, so purchasers and the retailers as well, had used a blockchain with very low transaction fees, they would have saved about $200 billion on credit card transactions. And then, of course, there's the international use cases where there's the global remittance use case. I want to send money back from X country to Y country. The automation of foreign exchange transactions. And one that I'm very excited about is the potential for payroll payments that go across borders, especially as we talk about the gig economy and people being able to work remotely and anywhere in the world to serve a client anywhere in the world. I've seen technology that does things like create virtualized routing numbers and account numbers similar to a bank account. So a contractor can essentially bill their client, say, pay this bank account, and then that'll be tied to a digital wallet behind the scenes and automatically perform the conversion from, let's say, US dollars to a Wyoming stable token, rather than having to go from US dollars to a different fiat currency to get potentially brought back into US dollars through a fairly convoluted process. So we look to automate a lot of that, hopefully in time, with a Wyoming stable token. So now, up next up, I want to talk about some of the benefits and challenges of the Wyoming stable token. And to a certain extent, there's going to be overlap between these because some of the benefits for us, things like a first mover advantage potentially, are also challenges. We have to work in these spaces where things have not been done before. So one of the benefits we believe is transparency. Did we say disclosures will be made in accordance with stringent requirements for state agencies? So again, as a taxpayer-funded agency, we have to be transparent in all the things we do. That's one of the reasons why we have all of our documentation and work on a Notion page, because we believe that's the best way to accommodate that. And one other thing I would mention here about transparency that I think will be a big selling point for our end users is the fact that this commission will need to create rules around how the stable token works. Now, I want to be specific. The state legislature, which we are not, makes laws. Our agency, the commission, has the capability to make rules, which are not laws, but kind of have the form of laws. And we do have that as a statutory carve-out that we're allowed to make the rules that are required for us to do this issuance. For example, the two big rule sets we look to have pushed forward before launch are around reserves management and around the token treatment. So reserves management, we have some decent starting points. In the US, we have guidance that's put forth by the New York Department of Financial Services. Again, that's not rules, it is guidance, but that's what they use to oversee some of the stable token issuers that are working in the state of New York. Further, we do in the US have proposed federal regulation, whether that's the Payment Clarity and Payment Stablecoins Act from formerly Representative McHenry, more recently Senator Hagerty, or whether that's the Lummis-Gillibrand Payment Stablecoin Act. These are both decent starting points for us. But what we've done as a commission is looked more broadly than that, because internationally, there are multiple different frameworks that are either proposed or promulgated. So what our Chief Risk and Compliance Officer, Deborah Brooks, has done is looked at about 16 of these different frameworks. Again, both the domestic ones here in the US, as well as what's happening with the Bank of England, MiCA, the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, the JFSA in Japan, Singapore Monetary Authority. And what we've done is we've tried to create this set of rules that's going to take these different components that we believe would be best for the state and then create our own reserves management policy based on that. And again, to push those rules forward, that's not something the commission can do unilaterally. The commission will need to go through a public process, including 45 days of public comment, before we're allowed to put those rules into place and therefore issue the token and abide by those rules. The second big bucket of rules would be what I referred to previously as token treatment. This would be specifically how the token is minted and issued, redeemed, potentially burned, interdicted. We'll need to define all of that. And that's, again, where we hope to instill some confidence in the end user that, for example, the commission can't unilaterally zap your tokens from orbit. There will be a process in place, including possibly subpoenas to accommodate that. And that's, again, these are things that require a month and a half of public comment. These are not terms and conditions that our commission can change overnight. These are things that take a long time to promulgate and we will need to abide by. So I may have over-engineered that one bullet, but I think it's an important one to explain how we are, the framework we're using to bring this issuance forward, as well as the confidence we hope it inspires in the end users. Second benefit here for the end user is over-collateralization. So in our statute, there is a requirement that we have to be 102% reserved. We have to create this buffer to mitigate against the risk of any kind of depegging event. So for example, if we have 100 million Wyoming stable tokens outstanding, the expectation is we're going to need to have $102 million worth of reserves, again, cash and treasuries, in our trust account. And that, again, is a statutory requirement. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, this is intended to be a public good. So as those treasuries start generating interest income, these are funds that are not going to go to, buy the commission a plane so we could go to every crypto event all around the world on a week-to-week basis, as fun as that sounds. These are funds that will be swept into the school foundation fund and go on to be held in that capacity. So in terms of challenges, again, there might be even some overlap here, but when we talk about both regulations and rulemaking, in the United States, there is no market function bill around digital assets generally, nor is there any specific legislation around stable tokens. So we're really the first mover here. And even though at the end of last week, there was an executive order from the Trump administration around digital assets that included proposing a stablecoin framework within the first 6 months of the administration, it's possible that we will be first to market. Nothing set in stone, but we're certainly working expeditiously, and we have been for some time on this. But that does mean, again, we will be the first out there with this type of offering. And of course, we will need to do all the work ourselves. We talked about rulemaking, again, how much of a benefit that is. But again, there is a lengthy public comment period for that. And we need to make sure that we don't, by the time we put these rules into the public forum, they are solid enough that we don't need to go back and redraft them. Another potential challenge for us is security. There are a lot of concerns around privacy when it comes to stable tokens. The hope here is we can incorporate things like zero-knowledge proofs or homomorphic encryption to the extent that the state of Wyoming can have visibility into who is using the token, but perhaps it's obfuscated on a public blockchain itself. And again, that's where we need to get into the nitty-gritty of some of the more recent technical developments around blockchain. But what we've seen along the way is a lot of impressive privacy tech emerging within even the last year. And the last one we have on here is education, right? So we're having this conversation with the Digital Euro Association. I think most people know what stablecoins are and how they work. However, for members of the public who may not be aware of what blockchain is, have heard negative things about crypto, there will be a bit of a hurdle here to explain how stable tokens can benefit both users and retailers or even institutions in the capacity that we could be very efficient, lower fees, etc. I think I got more to say about that here. Right. So just a couple of additional benefits, and we'll cover off on these quickly because I think there's some overlap between what we've already talked about. A Wyoming stable token released on a public blockchain can be used to settle dollar-denominated transactions of any size, anywhere on Earth, in seconds, incurring fees less than 1 cent while minimizing counterparty risk. So we talked about education. That is the one sentence, very verbose sentence, but the one sentence that I believe kind of communicates well the value of a Wyoming stable token, how it could be used. We talked about the first mover advantage. Again, we are looking to move very quickly. We've brought a full team on to help us with this effort as we bring forth rulemaking. We put the token together through our procurement process. But again, we are the first mover, and perhaps our legal framework is something that will be adopted at the federal level. We will see. In terms of the stable token, again, we do expect it to maintain its stability. We talked about the reserve requirement that is part of our statute. Another thing to consider is, of course, making sure that we have enough liquidity to meet the demands of our end users for a Wyoming stable token. One of the things we'll make sure is even on different platforms, we don't have any kind of depeg because there are people looking to use Wyoming stable tokens, but there's not sufficient liquidity. So that's certainly one of the things our team is looking at alongside the state treasurer's office. An interesting nuance here is how stablecoins impact considerations around US debt. So we've got $36 trillion of debt in the United States and counting. It's a big number. We need buyers of this debt if we're going to keep selling it or creating USD. printing USD would be a better way to put that. But if you look at some of our foreign holders of US debt, it's typically been a downward trajectory. It's been more sales than buys over the last several years. However, if you look at fiat-backed stablecoins in aggregate, they would represent a top 20 holder of US debt. And therefore, if we need to continue handling what could be a very an impending debt crisis in the not too distant future, stablecoins could be an answer for that. And I would add that that's become a broader part of the dialogue, especially again with the executive order that came out last week, but even going back to last summer, former Speaker Paul Ryan put out a op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, much to the same extent. And something that I like to highlight here as part of these conversations. And of course, we want to talk about US dollar dominance. I, of course, come from the position of being in the US, so I'm a little bit biased on this one. But we know that roughly 90+% of foreign exchange transactions are ultimately settled in dollars. However, with the sanctions activities of the prior administration, we do know that many nation states have begun selling off dollars that are in their treasury. So the hypothesis here is we need some kind of digitized dollar that will be more liquid, can settle anywhere in the world almost instantaneously, to help increase the US dollar's hegemony. And stablecoins have certainly been identified as a way to do that and protect the USD as the world's reserve currency. So kind of an abrupt shift back to where we are as the commission. We do not have a very big budget to run this. It is taxpayer funded, so perhaps this is an appropriate number, but the commission has been appropriated $5.8 million to get this off the ground. That would pale in comparison to what Circle or Paxos have raised, and I'll let you look those numbers up, but it's a small amount in comparison. But we've been very good fiscal stewards of the program to date. So within about 2 years of operations, we spent just over $500,000. And the goal here for this agency is to be self-sustaining. So this is not a program that intends to go back to the legislature during our budget sessions, ask for more taxpayer funding to fund this program. The goal is to be a self-sufficient agency, again, with some of the interest that we're going to be generating off those underlying securities. And I'll also add as one more point here, the commission is essentially mandated to pay back the $5.8 million of funding to the state's general fund. So again, we're taking these dollars to stand this program up. Those dollars are due back. We will pay for our own operating expenses, and then we would pay for the school foundation fund with the remaining fund in the coffer. And then in terms of next steps, so this is kind of dovetailing off of the procurement piece we talked about a little earlier. We do have our RFPs are due within the coming weeks, some in the coming days. Again, we have 7 of them. So there's difference of timing between them, but the ones that are coming up soon would include the token design and issuance, token support, so that's the exchanges, on-chain analytics, internal controls, because we need to make sure we have a robust internal controls framework in place for our launch, and then ecosystem intelligence, which is kind of the off-chain data analysis around how stable tokens are being used. We also have, subsequent to that, in the next couple of weeks, 2 of our large RFPs on financial management. So essentially that's who's going to be managing the reserves, right? So when dollars come in, who is going to be investing those dollars and directing them? Who's doing the custody of the fiat as well as the securities? Who's calculating our daily NAV and all the other kind of back office components around making sure that we, on, let's say, a fairly recurring basis, even up to a daily basis, have an idea of how many tokens outstanding in circulation there are, reconciled against our reserves to make sure we are approaching or going beyond that 102% statutory requirement. And the other one that's due soon is financial audit attestation. Again, we want to make sure this has all of the best practices of existing incumbent stablecoins and go a little bit further than that. Once those RFPs are in, we'll assess them, we'll perform some interviews, and then we'll engage qualified vendors for the deployment, development, and management of Wyoming stable tokens. And the hope is that would happen within the first half of March, and then target a fairly immediate turnaround to a testnet launch on one blockchain. So we would expect that the first Wyoming stable tokens to be released would be on a testnet. They wouldn't necessarily be backed. But again, since the hope for our commission, the goal of our commission, is to work with third parties that have built the constituent components of a stablecoin before. We would expect that the testnet launch would be fairly turnkey. We then spend the next couple of months making sure that the pipes behind the reserves and the reconciliation to the tokens that are live at any time also work. And then we would expect a end of Q2 fully reserved launch for that. And then beyond, I will specify, we do have a mandate from the Select Committee on Blockchain, which is kind of a branch of the legislature in the state of Wyoming. We do have a remit from them to be a multi-chain offering in time. So while we will definitionally start on one chain, we do expect to branch out fairly quickly thereafter. Now, when I say fairly quickly, that doesn't mean the next day. It means there'll need to be lots of testing involved to make sure things work as intended. But our team is looking at different bridging models, cross-chain interoperability, to see how we can facilitate that perhaps more quickly within 2025 than we could have in 2024, 2023. In terms of who the team is, again, to point out who the commissioners are, we do have the governor, state auditor, and state treasurer on the commission, as well as Commissioner Naves. Joe Reville is the CEO of Two Oceans Trust, one of the first, if not the first, Bitcoin trusts in the US. David Pope, who is a local tax audit practitioner who focuses on digital asset clients and has been part of both the commission and the select committee as the governor's liaison for several years, about almost a decade. And then we have Jeff Wallace as well, who runs one of the local community banks, because the hope is we can involve community banks and credit unions as this program matures. I certainly heard enough about me and from me, so I will skip over myself. But Deborah Brooks is our Chief Risk and Compliance Officer. Prior to joining us at the Stable Token Commission, she did work for the New York Department of Financial Services, specifically overseeing some of the incumbent stablecoin organizations, where she was the Deputy Virtual Currency Chief and Head of Supervision, and she's the one who's helping drive forward all the rulemaking. We've also brought on Keith Lawhorn, who is our Chief Information Security Officer, who has a solid cybersecurity background, has supported law enforcement for a number of years, potentially around illicit financial activity and the interdiction thereof, and even has patents around cryptocurrency hardware wallets. Joseph Saldana joined as our Chief Financial Officer. His tenure goes back to the days of Lehman Brothers and Deutsche Bank, but has also been working his own firms and his own capital, PE and capital firms for the last couple of years, and even has built his own oracles around digital asset pricing. And then Stephanie Chan joined as our business project manager. She is someone who's been in the blockchain and crypto space, digital asset space, for the majority of her career. And we work out of Cheyenne together. But I will specify this team came together fairly recently. So again, I think the amount of work we're able to generate and push forward in a short amount of time is really a testament to the caliber of people we brought onto this program. And then I would invite everybody to stay in touch. So you have my email here. If you'd like to reach out directly. If you wanted to scan this QR code, that will bring you to our website. And again, it's stabletoken.yo.gov. And we are on X, formerly known as Twitter. All of our meetings are broadcast live on Zoom. They are public, and you can actually join them, watch them live, and add public comment. But we upload the recordings to YouTube. We are on Warpcast, and we are on GitHub with the username @YOStable. So again, as part of my disclaimer, as you likely saw, if it's not one of these four with that handle, it's not us. So be aware of that. And I think that is about the end of the presentation. So Conrad, I will go to you first if you or Tamara had any questions or things I should clarify along the way. Beyond that, I'm more than happy to segue into questions that may have come through on the broadcast.
Anthony, thank you so much. Wonderful, great summary of a very complex but also a very pioneering project. And we're very grateful for your insights that you shared. I do have a couple of questions from the audience. Maybe we could dive straight into those now that you've had a swig of water. So the first one is a bit of a technical question. So the question is from Michael S. It says, what advantage does a public permissionless blockchain with KYC have over a database? I'm not sure exactly what he's talking about in terms of which aspects, but would you be able to touch on a few of those?
Sure. So I think we need to kind of join in public and permissionless piece with the permission onboarding piece. Because if we were talking about just a permission chain, I would argue there's really not much difference between a database and using a permissioned blockchain for it. We're looking to do both because we expect at some time, this is a good vector to talk about how we intend to go to market. We expect at some points to perhaps be able to go directly from Wyoming as the issuer directly to an end user. And if that's the case, we will likely need some kind of KYC AML component to make sure that we're not distributing tokens to people who shouldn't be using something issued by the state of Wyoming. That being said, one thing I did not really discuss was our initial issuance and how that intends to work. So in the early days of stable tokens issuance, we intend to use what we refer to in our business plan as licensed service providers, or more colloquially, resellers of the token, to get the Wyoming Stable Token from our issuance and mint to an end user. So that would be your exchanges, those could be payment platforms, those could be market makers. These are organizations that already have KYC AML capabilities and we can rely on to do so. But going forward, again, the hope would be we could be a bit more efficient if we could distribute directly to an end user. So that's where some of the considerations around perhaps permission chains and the KYC AML component come on. And again, when we talk about permission chain, to be very specific and get a bit more technical, these are not things we would use where the permission chain would be the kind of end all be all for the state of Wyoming, because I think at that point the database argument would be relevant. The networks we're looking at, again, through that blockchain selection exercise, had to have both. You had to be a public network, but have an option for permissioned onboarding, whether that was via smart contract, which is something that you would see in, let's say, Ethereum, and the EU CRV stable token from SocGen has something like that. There's a whitelist. You have to whitelist your address. That's one model for doing that. There's other models where, let's say, you had an Avalanche L1, and to be, it's a little bit of nuance in the wording here. Avalanche used to call them subnets. Now they call everything an L1 because they're interoperable. But you could have a Wyoming subnet with a stable token for onboarding and then bridge into the broader Avalanche ecosystem. And that's a good point when it comes to talking about why we're putting this on a public chain, because we do want to utilize the broader ecosystem. We talk about the kind of expansion of things like gaming or tokenized assets or tokenized securities. We will need to be successful, we'll need to be where all of those different digital assets are. And those are all emerging on public blockchains. So that if we want to use a Wyoming stable token, the hope is that we would have something that is on the chains where that activity is happening. Different chains have different levels of activity for different kinds of industries, but that's why we also want to be a multi-chain offering. And I won't say too much more because, again, we do have this ongoing procurement process, but I think your audience is probably well aware of like what activity is happening on certain chains, where securities issuances are happening versus where the memes are happening versus where the games are happening. I'll let everyone look into that themselves, but we need to be where the action is, and that's on public blockchains.
Great. I think that's a well-rounded answer to that question. And then we have another one. They're kind of rolling in now. Are there any incentives planned to encourage the use of the Wyoming stablecoin within the states and beyond? So, for instance, payments for state-related, state-specific payments, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes. So, again, I can't say too much about this because a lot of it is still preliminary or exploratory, but we are certainly looking at ways to utilize the stable token in the state. One of the things that has been said in a public forum, so I'm happy to repeat it here, by the treasurer, who again is one of our commissioners, is looking into different pools of funding around the state to see if any of it can be deployed in a stable token to help perhaps create some of that liquidity. In terms of programs in the state where, let's say, there's a special discount for, going to pay for my coffee downtown with the Wyoming stable token versus a credit card. We haven't discussed any of those yet, but the thought is that'll be part of a kind of a broader marketing push when we have a testnet token and can actually share that with people, because I think for those who are unfamiliar with this technology, the best way to kind of figure out its benefits and how it works is to use it yourself. And that's what I did in my startup life before I had the suit and tie on every day when I was wearing the V-necks and hoodies. So that's certainly consideration. And then one more thing I would mention is we are looking at some methods for the stable token to perhaps do things like bear a yield, and not by staking or any measures like that, but kind of natively bear a yield. Again, that is a very high level concept. And again, one that's going to require a significant amount of work from a compliance perspective before we can do something like that. So hopefully there's no headlines where Wyoming Stable Token starts distributing yield, from day one. But states do have some exemptions around securities laws. And if you look at the SEC and the environment here in the US, a lot of the yield-bearing stable tokens have, ones that are natively yield-bearing, have gone offshore. So Mountain Protocol, Agora, operating out of Bermuda, to be outside the remit of the SEC. We can look at certain exceptions around that to see if we perhaps can do one that would provide a native interest, native yield, which is something that the incumbent stable tokens can't do.
Great. And then we have another one related to public-private partnerships. What role do you see for these public-private partnerships in advancing the adoption of stablecoins into the mainstream, especially the Wyoming stablecoin? I think you did touch on it slightly a bit earlier, but do you want to maybe just identify some of the private partnerships that you guys have considered towards advancing your particular stablecoin?
So this is a good opportunity for clarification, because to be specific, we are not pursuing a public-private partnership. We are pursuing direct vendor engagements where they can build the stable token on our behalf or help us kind of get things to market. But these will be fully engaged vendors, and Wyoming State will always be the legal issuer of the stable token, which likely means we'll be the ones hitting the buttons, and we'll need our own multi-sig MPC solutions. These are all things where, again, we're taking startup world and scrunching it down into the confines of state government. So there's no direct public-private partnership necessarily, although we do intend to work with those third parties. We will be the ones responsible for that particular issuance. When it comes to working with third parties to help us circulate the token, again, I would hesitate to call those public-private partnerships, but again, going back to our discussion around resellers, we have, again, in our business plan, put forth a proposal that we would do things like revenue share agreements with them for helping circulate the token. In that capacity, many of these partners would kind of look like market makers, whether they are market makers specifically, whether they are exchanges, whether they are payment platforms, anyone who would require, a large volume, an institutional volume of stable tokens to form their operations. We could potentially do a revenue share with them. Again, that's not defined quite yet, but that is something that has been proposed along the way. And then in terms of, I think the question asked for other states or beyond doing public-private partnerships. I think it would certainly be easier to pick one vendor and say, we're going to build this thing together than do 7 concurrent requests for proposals across 19 different functions. But for us, we need to make sure we're doing this process in a highly transparent and fair environment, because there is so many moving pieces. There's so many different ways that the technology works, which is best for the state. Something that's going to be a lengthier effort, and that's what we're going through right now.
Great. Thanks for that clarification. It makes a lot of sense. And obviously, you're still at early days to some extent, so a lot of these questions will be answered in due time. And then finally, we have a question. We have other questions, but most of them seem to have been answered already in your presentation, so I won't touch on those. But maybe one for the future. Where do you see this project being in 5 years? And do you foresee any other states jumping in and competing with you? So, you could potentially have many state-backed stablecoins eventually. Obviously, you guys would be the first, but yeah, well, where do you see that potentially landing?
Well, I'll do the second one first, which is I think if we launch this program and it becomes successful, because everything we do is public, it'll be pretty easy for any other state to kind of copy and paste the work that we've done. That's why I think it's important to kind of integrate as fast as possible into multiple public blockchains, to be everywhere we possibly can, to have figured out all of these, we're using exemptions around, securities and things like that. That's why we're trying to boil the ocean to a certain extent from the get-go here, because we do think it'd be fairly trivial to copy and paste some of this, because again, the legislation is public, all of our documents are public. We're doing this for the first time, and hopefully if we can get this done right and get kind of the market share we hope to gain, then we can kind of be off to the races here, but we shall see on that front. And then the second question about where we see this in 5 years, my hope would be that this program has really taken off, has a market cap that can not only sustain itself, but sustain that 102% buffer and also be contributing well into the state's budget. To give you just a quick numerical contrast here, Tether, I don't know if their Q4 numbers are out quite yet, but Tether's probably on track to make about $10-11 billion in profits in 2024, which would make it probably one of the, if not the most profitable company per employee in human history. I don't think we're going to be doing everything that Tether does to generate those types of returns, but the entire state budget for Wyoming, biennial budgets over 2 years of state budget in Wyoming, is $11 billion, right? So even if we are a tenth of what Tether is, we could have a fairly material impact on the state budget. I would hope to grow that over time. But if you want to go one step further, again, this is a commission with one very specific remit to issue the Wyoming Stable Token. My hope is, and again, this is very much my own personal opinion, my hope is in the future, this commission can look more like other agencies within the state that have multiple divisions thereunder. I would hope that someday perhaps this is the Wyoming Digital Asset Authority and stable tokens is one division thereof. I would hope that we can in time have a division for tokenized assets, real world assets. This state is rich in gold and silver, land and livestock, oil and gas, rare earth metals that are being used for all these AI GPUs, and even uranium. So these are things I would like to put on chain in some capacity. And then the final one for me is voting on chain. We have a very tight set of rules around voting in the state of Wyoming, and it's worked well to date. But I do know there's interest in putting voting on chain. That to me will be downstream of robust solutions around digital identity. It's something that I've heard talked about for years. I don't think we're quite there yet. I think that's still a year, 18 months, 2 years off. But I would hope in the future that a division within this agency can handle on-chain voting tied to some kind of DID that would help really shore up elections and make sure there's no fraud therein. And that's my 5 to maybe 7 year plan. We'll put it that way. I'll add an extra 2 years on it.
Hopefully, of course, you'll be heading up that digital assets unit. Of course, having been an early pioneer in establishing all of this. But I mean, personally, I would like to applaud your state's efforts in diversifying revenue, especially into the future, because I think this would potentially be a model and, like you mentioned, a catalyst for the digitalization of other services and assets, and a large overhaul of revenue diversification within from the public sector. So I think it's really commendable what you guys have established here. And I think it's only a matter of time before others follow suit. I think we are coming to the end of our time together. Unfortunately, there are many other questions, but I would encourage those with questions to have a look at the Notion site, which we have included in the YouTube notes or chat rather. And we will also potentially get a copy of the notes from you, Anthony, afterwards, the slides, and then distribute that to whoever would like a copy of those. But nonetheless, we'd like to thank you very much, Anthony, for your time. It's been incredibly valuable to learn more about the project from the horse's mouth, so to speak. And I think that it's been incredibly enriching. And no doubt there are other states and public sector representatives that are going to be paying close attention to this project and potentially in developing something very similar in the not too distant future. We'd like to also extend a big thank you to yourself, but not only to yourself, but to also our attendees who participated online, and also to our standard members who have contributed towards making this possible. We also want to say we look forward to welcoming your colleague Deborah Brooks at the Digital Euro Conference at the end of March, the 27th of March in Frankfurt. We look forward to more insights from her, as she is quite seasoned in the virtual asset space as well. So looking forward to picking her brain in Frankfurt at the end of March at the Digital Euro Conference 2025. And if anyone is interested in staying up to date with the DIA's work, including future events, membership opportunities, and other thought leadership opportunities, please visit our website or follow us on social media. And thank you very much again, Anthony, for your time. We know you've been quite busy and there's a lot happening. And we look forward to seeing everybody else at the next roundtable. Without further ado, I'd like to close the roundtable now and wish everyone a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.